Winston Churchill, in one of his more candid reflections on the Second World War, admitted something that might have surprised those who saw him as the embodiment of British defiance. Among all the threats that Britain faced during those dark years, from the Blitz that rained fire on London to the possibility of invasion across the Channel, there was only one danger that truly kept him awake at night with genuine fear gnawing at his confidence. That danger came not from the skies above or the armies massing across the water, but from beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The U-boat menace, as he called it, represented an existential threat that could have strangled Britain into submission without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. But as the war progressed and technology evolved in unexpected ways, even these underwater predators that had terrorized merchant shipping would discover that they too could know fear. The source of that fear would come not from the heavily armed destroyers that hunted them, nor from the depth charges that exploded in their wake, but from an aircraft that seemed almost absurd in its construction, built primarily from wood and fabric, yet carrying within its slim frame a weapon so devastating that it could end a submarine's existence in mere seconds. The question that would haunt German submariners throughout 1943 and 1944 was simple yet terrifying. What kind of weapon could destroy a steel submarine in just 18 seconds, leaving those who survived to whisper in horror that the ocean itself had transformed into an abattoir where metal hulls were split open as easily as butchers cleave meat? The answer lay in an unlikely marriage of British ingenuity and desperate necessity, a combination that would produce one of the war's most fearsome anti-submarine weapons. On December 23, 1943, the Bay of Biscay presented itself as it so often did during those winter months, cold and grey and utterly without mercy. The waters rolled in long, heavy swells that spoke of storms brewing further out in the Atlantic. Standing on the conning tower of U-128, a German submarine that measured some 70 metres from bow to stern, Captain Werner Beck swept his binoculars across the horizon in a methodical pattern that had become second nature during his years of service. His vessel represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering, a predator crafted from steel and powered by diesel engines, designed and built for the singular purpose of stalking Allied convoys and sending their cargo to the bottom of the sea. Yet despite the formidable reputation of his U-boat and the skill of his crew, Beck could not shake the feeling that had been growing stronger with each passing month. The hunter, he felt in his bones, had somehow become the hunted. Every time U-128 surfaced to run her diesel engines and recharge the batteries that powered her electric motors while submerged, Beck knew he was gambling with the lives of every man aboard. The 18 minutes they needed in the open air, exposed on the surface where any patrol plane might spot them, had become a period of almost unbearable tension. What had once been routine had transformed into a deadly game of chance where the stakes were survival itself. High above the cold waters of the Bay of Biscay, thousands of feet up where the air was thin and frigid, another hunter was closing in on his prey. Squadron leader Charles Anderson guided his de Havilland Mosquito through banks of cloud with the practiced ease of a pilot who had logged hundreds of hours in the wooden aircraft. To most observers, the Mosquito appeared to be just another warplane, though perhaps an unusual one given its construction from plywood, balsa wood, and adhesive rather than the aluminum and steel that formed the backbone of most military aircraft. But Anderson's particular Mosquito was far from ordinary. Protruding from its nose, where one might expect to see machine guns or perhaps a bomb aimer's position, jutted the barrel of a weapon that would have seemed more at home on a battlefield than in an aircraft. It was a 57mm cannon, the same type of anti-tank gun that had proven itself capable of punching through German armour on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. Some brilliant mind in the British military establishment had decided to take this tank-killing weapon and mount it in an aircraft, creating something that German U-boat commanders could never have imagined in their worst nightmares. The Mosquito that Anderson flew, designated officially as the FB Mark 18, but known to those who flew and maintained it by a more evocative name, the Tsetse, was not simply another aircraft in the vast inventory of Allied air power. It had become something approaching judgment made manifest, a combination of speed, surprise, and devastating firepower that could appear without warning and deliver destruction before its target even understood what was happening. The intelligence network that had broken German codes through the Ultra project had whispered the position of U-128 to the British. The radar sets that had shrunk in size while growing in capability had painted the submarine on Anderson's scope. And now, hidden in the darkness and cloud, Anderson's wooden aircraft descended with a fury that was all the more terrible for its silence. The mathematics of survival and death in this encounter had been reduced to a simple equation of time, 18 seconds. That brief span separated Beck's command from continued existence or utter destruction. It was the time needed for a U-boat crew to hear the alarm, scramble down the hatches, seal the boat, and begin flooding the ballast tanks that would pull them beneath the surface where the water itself became armour against attack. 18 seconds between the first warning cry of an aircraft spotted and the roar of shells tearing through steel plate as if it were paper. Beck's hands gripped the icy rail of his conning tower as he continued his scan of the sky and sea. Anderson's finger moved toward the trigger that would unleash the cannon's fury. Even the ocean itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. This was steel against wood, the depths against the sky, one predator closing with another in a confrontation where only one would survive. And in those 18 seconds that hung between the present moment and the immediate future, history itself was about to be rewritten in violence and fire. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it came to be known in the historical record, was never simply a contest between ships and submarines, though certainly those vessels played the starring roles in the drama that unfolded across thousands of miles of ocean. At its heart, this battle represented something more fundamental and more desperate, a war of starvation versus sustenance, of fuel against the lack thereof, of time itself becoming a weapon as precious as any bomb or torpedo. By 1942, the U-boat arm commanded by Admiral Karl Dönitz had transformed the Atlantic into a killing ground where Allied merchant ships died by the dozens. The waters that connected Britain to North America and the rest of the world had become prowled by what Dönitz himself called wolf packs, groups of submarines that coordinated their attacks to overwhelm convoy defences. The nights were illuminated by the funeral pyres of burning tankers and freighters. Oil slicks spread across the dark water in rainbow patterns that marked where ships had gone down. Survivors, those fortunate enough to escape their sinking vessels, clung desperately to whatever wreckage they could find, their screams and pleas swallowed by the indifferent vastness of the Atlantic before rescue could arrive, if it arrived at all. The wolf packs had established their dominance over these waters through a combination of superior tactics and the simple mathematics of destruction. They had made the Atlantic Ocean their private hunting preserve, and the Allies were hemorrhaging shipping tonnage at an unsustainable rate. Winston Churchill, in his later admission of fear, captured the essence of what Britain faced with a voice that carried the weight of sleepless nights and desperate calculations. He confessed that of all the dangers Britain confronted during the war, the only thing that genuinely frightened him, that truly kept him awake with worry, was the U-boat peril. It was not the Luftwaffe dropping bombs on London, devastating as those raids were. It was not even Hitler's armies driving deep into the Soviet Union, threatening to knock Russia out of the war. The threat that most concerned Churchill came from the invisible menace that operated beneath the waves, the submarines that threatened to sever the lifeline connecting Britain to America and thereby starve the British Isles into submission. Admiral Dönitz had developed a doctrine of submarine warfare that was as cruel in its simplicity as it was effective in its execution. The goal was straightforward: sink Allied shipping faster than the Allies could build new ships to replace their losses. It was a brutal calculus of tonnage and time, an equation written in steel and blood where the variables were merchant vessels sent to the bottom and the rate at which new ones could be launched from shipyards. Throughout the early years of the war, the numbers told a story of catastrophe from the Allied perspective and triumph from the German viewpoint. Entire convoys would simply vanish, swallowed by the Atlantic as if they had never existed. Merchant ships carrying vital supplies, tankers filled with precious fuel, troop transports bringing soldiers to the war zones, all of them became food for the wolves that stalked beneath the surface. By the time 1942 drew to a close, Allied shipping losses had reached levels that genuinely threatened Britain's ability to continue the war. There were months when nearly 1 million tons of shipping was destroyed, sent to the ocean floor by German torpedoes. The initial Allied response to this submarine onslaught was hampered by defensive thinking and inadequate resources. Escort destroyers accompanied the convoys, sailing at the periphery of the merchant formations, but they operated under severe constraints that limited their effectiveness. These escorts were essentially tethered to the convoys they protected. They could not pursue U-boats too aggressively or chase them too far, because doing so would leave the merchant vessels exposed to attack from other submarines. The escorts defended their charges, but they did not hunt the hunters. This defensive posture meant that U-boats could strike and then slip away, confident in their ability to survive and attack again. The cycle repeated itself again and again, with German submarines growing more confident and more aggressive as their success mounted. Yet within this situation of German dominance lay the seeds of its eventual reversal. The Allies, though battered and bleeding, refused to accept defeat. They began to adapt, to learn, to innovate in ways that would gradually turn the tide. At Bletchley Park in England, brilliant minds laboured to crack the German Enigma codes, and their success meant that Allied intelligence could listen to the supposedly secret communications between U-boats and their command. The Allies developed new technologies to pierce the darkness that had shielded the submarines. Radar sets evolved rapidly, becoming smaller, more powerful, and more discriminating, able to detect even small objects on the ocean's surface. Sonar systems improved, turning the water itself into a medium that betrayed the presence of submerged submarines. These technologies combined to strip away the cloak of invisibility that U-boats had relied upon. By the middle of 1943, the strategic situation in the Atlantic had begun its fundamental shift. Convoys no longer sailed with merely defensive escorts trailing along beside them. Now they moved with purpose-built submarine killers, vessels and aircraft specifically designed to hunt down and destroy U-boats. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls, brought air power far out into the Atlantic where land-based planes could not reach. These floating airfields launched Avenger torpedo bombers and Wildcat fighters that extended the reach of Allied surveillance and striking power beyond the horizon. Destroyer escorts, smaller and more numerous than full-sized destroyers but heavily armed with depth charges and the new Hedgehog mortar, scoured the seas with their sonar. Intelligence from Ultra, technology in the form of improved radar and sonar, and new tactical doctrines wove together into a net that began to close around the wolf packs. For the German U-boat captains and their crews, their world began to shrink in ways both literal and psychological. Where once they had ruled the waves with something approaching impunity, able to surface, attack, and dive again with relative confidence in their safety, now every emergence from the depths became a calculated risk. Every shadow on the horizon might be a destroyer. Every sound in the water might be a depth charge on its way down. The Bay of Biscay, that body of water between France and Spain that U-boats had to transit to reach their hunting grounds in the Atlantic, transformed from a corridor to freedom into a gauntlet of fear. Aircraft from RAF Coastal Command circled overhead in ever-increasing numbers. Radar pulses swept through the night, detecting submarines that thought themselves hidden by darkness. Even the ocean, which had been the submarine's ally and refuge, now seemed to betray them as improved sonar turned every sound into a beacon revealing their position. Despite all these improvements and innovations, one significant problem remained unsolved for the Allies. Depth charges, the primary submarine-killing weapon carried by surface ships and aircraft, were certainly brutal in their effect when they exploded near a submarine, but they were fundamentally imprecise weapons. The pressure wave from a depth charge explosion could damage or destroy a submarine, but only if the charge detonated close enough, and determining the exact depth at which a submarine was hiding proved difficult. Bombs dropped by aircraft could damage submarines caught on the surface, but again, they had to hit close to the target to be effective, and submarines were small targets that could begin diving the moment they spotted an attacking plane. Too often, submarines that were hit by depth charges or near missed by bombs would limp away damaged but still alive, able to return to port for repairs and eventually return to sea. What the Allies needed was a weapon that could strike instantly and decisively, a weapon that could deliver a killing blow to a submarine before the ocean could close protectively around it, before the U-boat could escape into the depths where it might survive. The answer to this problem was still being developed, still being tested, still waiting to make its appearance in the battle. That answer would come not from steel but from wood, not from a massive weapon system, but from a relatively small aircraft that would be transformed into a predator feared more than the destroyers with their depth charges. It would be a weapon capable of killing in those crucial 18 seconds between detection and dive, a weapon that would make German submariners realize that their age of dominance was drawing to a close. When this weapon finally arrived in operational service, the wolves of the Atlantic would discover that the hunters had become the hunted, that their steel hulls offered no protection against a properly aimed blow, and that wood armed with the right gun could indeed kill steel. By the time 1943 arrived and began advancing toward its midpoint, the Atlantic Ocean had undergone a transformation in the minds of military strategists on both sides. It was no longer simply a battlefield in the conventional sense. It had evolved into something resembling a vast chessboard where the Allies, having learned from their early defeats and catastrophic losses, were finally beginning to understand how to think several moves ahead of their opponents. The old doctrine that had governed Allied anti-submarine warfare, the doctrine that emphasized escorting and defending convoys, had been largely abandoned as inadequate to the task of defeating the U-boat threat. In its place rose a new concept, one that was merciless in its efficiency and aggressive in its application. This was the hunter-killer system, an integrated approach to submarine warfare that combined multiple elements into a coordinated effort. At the heart of this hunter-killer system sat the escort carrier, a vessel that would never win any prizes for beauty or speed. These ships were small compared to fleet carriers, often converted from merchant vessel hulls, slow enough that submarines could outrun them on the surface, and ugly in the utilitarian way that purpose-built warships often are. Yet for all their apparent disadvantages, these escort carriers proved deadly in their designated role. Each one carried a small air group, typically a handful of Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers and Grumman Wildcat fighters. These aircraft could be launched to search vast areas of ocean, far beyond what the carrier's lookouts could see from the ship itself. Around each escort carrier steamed a screen of destroyer escorts, smaller vessels than full destroyers, but numerous and well-armed with sonar for detection, depth charges for attacks, and the new Hedgehog mortar that could throw a pattern of small bombs ahead of the ship. Together, the carrier and its escorts formed a mobile killing zone, a trap that moved through the ocean actively hunting submarines rather than waiting for the submarines to attack. This hunter-killer group represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. No longer would the Allies simply wait for U-boats to reveal themselves by attacking convoys. Now these groups would go out into the black vastness of the Atlantic with the specific mission of finding submarines and destroying them. They became roaming execution squads that brought the fight to the enemy. The wolf packs that Dönitz had deployed with such success suddenly found themselves being stalked by predators they could not escape. The gaps in convoy coverage that U-boats had exploited to move into position for attacks were now patrolled by hunter-killer groups eager for contact. Admiral Dönitz's submarines, which had enjoyed considerable freedom of movement in the early war years, now discovered themselves trapped in an ever-tightening net. The Enigma codes that had protected their communications had been broken, though the Germans remained unaware of this catastrophic security breach. Ultra-intelligence, the information derived from reading German encrypted messages, revealed U-boat patrol lines, their refueling rendezvous points, and even the areas where they surfaced to recharge their batteries. The hunters of yesterday increasingly found themselves ambushed by forces that seemed to know exactly where they would be. Betrayed by the silence of the radio waves that they thought secure, U-boats sailed into trap after trap. Yet nowhere was the transformation of the anti-submarine campaign more dramatic than in the role of air power. At the beginning of the war, the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had functioned as little more than a defensive screen, a force that patrolled but rarely killed. Large aircraft like the Consolidated Liberator and the short Sunderland flying boat lumbered through the air over the Atlantic, dropping depth charges when they encountered submarines. But more often than not, these aircraft arrived too late to catch U-boats on the surface. German submarine captains learned quickly to dive at the first sign of an aircraft, surfacing only under the cover of darkness when they needed to run their diesel engines and recharge the batteries that powered their electric motors when submerged. The Bay of Biscay took on particular importance in this aerial campaign. This body of water served as an artery for the U-boat force, a necessary corridor that submarines had to traverse when travelling between their bases on the French coast at ports like Lorient, Brest and Saint-Nazaire, and the open Atlantic where they would hunt Allied shipping. If the Allies could close this artery, if they could make the Bay of Biscay impassable, then the U-boats would be bottled up in their pens, unable to reach their hunting grounds. The submarines would effectively suffocate, strangled before they could even reach the battlefield. Coastal Command evolved to meet this opportunity. It would no longer simply patrol the Bay of Biscay, hoping to stumble across submarines. It would strike, aggressively and repeatedly, turning those waters into a killing zone. The lumbering patrol bombers gave way to faster, more agile aircraft. Radar technology advanced rapidly, with sets shrinking in size while simultaneously growing more powerful and discriminating. The introduction of centimetric radar proved particularly devastating to the U-boats. This new radar operated on a wavelength that German radar detectors could not pick up, which meant that U-boats no longer received any warning that they were being tracked. Suddenly, the ocean was no longer a place where submarines could hide. It became a stage illuminated by Allied technology, with U-boats caught in the spotlight with nowhere to hide. Despite all these advances, the Allies still faced a fundamental problem when it came to actually destroying submarines. Depth charges remained the primary weapon for both ships and aircraft, but they suffered from inherent limitations. When rolled off the stern of a ship or dropped from an aircraft, depth charges would sink to a preset depth before exploding. The explosion created a powerful pressure wave underwater that could crush a submarine's hull if it detonated close enough. But close enough was the operative phrase. Too often, depth charges exploded near a submarine without causing fatal damage. The U-boat might be shaken, some equipment might be knocked loose, perhaps some leaks might develop, but the submarine would survive. It might be forced to surface or limp back to base, but it would live to fight another day. What the Allies desperately needed was a weapon that could guarantee a kill, something that could strike a submarine with precision rather than relying on the approximate destruction of a depth charge. The gap in capability gnawed at the minds of strategists and tacticians. They could find U-boats with radar, they could force them to surface, they could even position their forces to attack, but the final blow, the killing strike, remained uncertain. Picture the scenario that played out repeatedly in the Bay of Biscay. A U-boat surfaces in the evening twilight to recharge its batteries, confident that it can dive within 30 seconds if threatened. An aircraft spots it, either visually or on radar. In those crucial seconds, the difference between the submarine's survival and its destruction came down not to bombs that might hit nearby, but to a weapon that could punch directly through the pressure hull before the submarine could escape. This led someone in the corridors of the British Air Ministry to ask a question that seemed almost absurd on its face. What if you could give an aircraft the same weapons that proved effective against tanks? What if the guns designed to destroy German armour on land could be turned against submarines at sea? The idea appeared mad when first proposed. Aircraft were built for speed and agility, not for absorbing the massive recoil of artillery pieces. Yet desperation has a way of breeding audacity, of making the impossible seem merely difficult. In some meeting room, some staff officer pointed to the Army's QF 6-pounder gun, a 57mm cannon that had already proven itself against German armour. German tank crews had learned to fear this weapon, which could penetrate the frontal armour of a Panzer IV tank and damage even the heavier Panther tank. If this gun could rip through the armoured hide of a tank, the reasoning went, why couldn't it punch through the pressure hull of a submarine? This concept became the seed from which a revolutionary weapon would grow. The weapon would not be a bomb or a torpedo or even a rocket. It would be a gun, a straightforward artillery piece that could fire armour-piercing shells directly at surfaced submarines. The shells would not rely on the uncertainty of a near miss. They would simply punch holes through the steel hull, holes that would doom any submarine to a quick death. But such a weapon could not be mounted on just any aircraft. It needed to be installed on a platform that was fast enough to catch surfaced submarines before they could dive, nimble enough to line up a shot in the few seconds available, and tough enough to absorb the punishing recoil of a gun that had never been intended for aerial mounting. The answer to this requirement lay not in any aircraft built primarily from steel, but in one constructed largely from wood. The de Havilland Mosquito had already earned a reputation as the wooden wonder, an aircraft that defied conventional thinking about what a warplane should be. While other nations built their aircraft from aluminum and steel, the British had created the Mosquito from plywood and balsa wood, held together with adhesive. Skeptics had dismissed the design as fragile, but pilots who flew the Mosquito adored it. The wooden construction made it light, and its twin engines made it fast enough to outrun virtually anything the Luftwaffe could send after it. The Mosquito had already proven itself capable of multiple roles. It could carry bombs to Berlin, evading German defences through sheer speed. It could carry cameras over occupied Europe for reconnaissance missions. It had served as a night fighter, hunting German bombers in the darkness over England. But in 1943, the Mosquito was about to receive a new mission and a new identity. It would cease to be just a bomber or a reconnaissance aircraft or a fighter. It would become an executioner, a specialized hunter designed for a single purpose, killing submarines. The hunter-killer doctrine had prepared the net of forces needed to trap U-boats. Ultra-intelligence had provided the ability to know where submarines would be. Radar technology had given the Allies the means to find submarines even in darkness or poor weather. But what had been missing was the blade, the weapon that could deliver an immediate, certain killing blow. That blade was about to be forged from the unlikely combination of British wood and a tank-killing cannon, creating an aircraft that would haunt the nightmares of every U-boat crew in the Atlantic. The birth of the aircraft that would come to be known as the Mosquito Tsetse was not a process marked by elegance or ease. It was instead an act of engineering defiance, a determined effort to make possible what many considered impossible. British engineers received an assignment that seemed to defy both physics and common sense. Take a cannon weighing approximately half a ton, a weapon designed to be mounted on a stable platform like a tank or a fixed emplacement, and somehow install it in the nose of a wooden aircraft without the recoil tearing the plane apart. The gun in question was the British QF 6-pounder, an anti-tank cannon with a caliber of 57mm. On the battlefields of North Africa, where British forces had fought Rommel's Afrika Korps, and in Normandy following the Allied invasion of France, this gun had proven its worth repeatedly. It had destroyed Panzer IV tanks, left Panther tanks crippled, and generally earned the respect of any German tanker unfortunate enough to face it. The shells fired by the 6-pounder were engineered for a single purpose: penetration. When such a shell struck armour plate, the steel did not resist for long. It yielded, cracking and splitting under the focused energy of the impact. Now, the task was to transform this land-based weapon into something that could fly and fight in the air. The first challenge the engineers faced was finding a way to mount the cannon in the Mosquito's nose section. In its standard configuration, a Mosquito carried machine guns in the nose or had a glazed compartment for a bomb aimer. All of that had to be stripped out to make room for the massive gun. The bare 57mm cannon, with its long barrel and substantial breech mechanism, protruded forward from the nose like a lance or spear, dominating the front aspect of the aircraft. But simply bolting such a weapon into position would never work. The recoil generated when the cannon fired would be enormous, far greater than the wooden airframe could absorb without catastrophic structural failure. Every time the gun fired, it would try to push itself backward with tremendous force, and if that force was transmitted directly to the plywood skin and wooden ribs of the aircraft, the Mosquito would simply come apart in mid-air. The solution required building a cradle of steel inside the wooden shell of the aircraft, a skeletal framework strong enough to contain and absorb the recoil forces. This internal structure would grip the cannon tightly while also spreading the recoil loads across multiple attachment points to the strongest parts of the airframe. The wooden ribs and plywood skin that made up the Mosquito's structure were never designed to handle such punishment, but with the steel cradle acting as an intermediary, the aircraft could survive the violence of firing its main gun. When the trigger was pulled and the cannon fired, the entire airplane would shudder and shake from the recoil, but crucially, it would hold together. The British engineers had achieved what many thought impossible. They had created a flying gun platform that could survive using its own weapon. The next challenge involved ammunition handling. The original 6-pounder gun, as used by the Army, required a crew to operate. In a tank, one man aimed and fired while another loaded shells into the breech, a continuous process during combat. But inside the cramped confines of a Mosquito, there was no room for a human loader, no space for a crew member to manually feed shells into the gun. The solution came in the form of an automatic loading system, a mechanical device that would feed ammunition from a magazine into the cannon's breech without human intervention. This autoloader was designed to be ruthlessly efficient. 25 rounds of ammunition could be carried and fired in rapid succession, with the mechanical loading system working faster than any human loader could have managed. Each shell loaded into the magazine was carefully chosen for its specific purpose. Some were armor-piercing rounds, fitted with ballistic caps that allowed them to punch through steel plate more effectively. Others were high-explosive shells designed to detonate on impact, useful for destroying anything exposed on a submarine's deck, or for attacking targets where penetration was less important than blast effect. With these modifications complete, the aircraft that emerged from the conversion process was officially designated as the Mosquito FB Mark 18, but almost immediately it acquired a nickname that better captured its nature. Pilots and ground crew began calling it the Tsetse, named after the African fly, whose bite transmitted sleeping sickness and death. The name fit perfectly. Like the insect, this aircraft was relatively small and seemed almost fragile, but its bite was absolutely deadly. The aircraft represented a complete transformation of the Mosquito from a fast bomber or reconnaissance plane into a highly specialized predator with a single purpose: killing submarines. In the air, the Tsetse presented an appearance that many found almost grotesque or ungainly. The Mosquito had always been a sleek, elegant aircraft, its wooden construction giving it smooth, flowing lines that spoke of speed and grace. But with the massive 57mm cannon protruding from its nose, the Tsetse looked oddly proportioned, as if someone had grafted a weapon that was too large onto an airframe too small to carry it. The long barrel jutting forward seemed to unbalance the aircraft visually, making it appear nose-heavy and awkward. Yet appearances in this case were thoroughly deceiving. Once airborne, the Tsetse flew with the same speed and agility that characterized all Mosquitoes. The additional weight of the cannon and its ammunition was noticeable, but not crippling. The aircraft retained its ability to cruise at high speed, to climb rapidly when needed, and to maneuver with the grace that had made the Mosquito beloved by its pilots. What had changed was the aircraft's role in combat. When the Tsetse dove on a target, when it lined up for an attack run, it was no longer delivering bombs or firing machine guns. It was bringing to bear a weapon of devastating precision and power. For the crews of German U-boats, who had grown accustomed to the threats posed by depth charges and bombs, the Tsetse represented a completely new kind of nightmare. Submarines had learned through bitter experience how to survive depth charge attacks. The charges were dangerous, certainly, capable of crushing a submarine's hull if they exploded close enough, but they were also imprecise weapons that gave submarines a chance of survival. A well-built U-boat could often endure near misses and even some direct hits from depth charges, limping away damaged but still operational. Bombs dropped by aircraft were similar. They were dangerous if they hit close to the submarine, but submarines were small, difficult targets that could begin diving the moment they spotted an attacking plane, often managing to get deep enough that bombs became ineffective. The Tsetse changed this equation completely. It did not attack with weapons that might wound or damage. It struck with precision, punching armor-piercing shells through a submarine's pressure hull before the U-boat had even begun its crash dive. For the men inside a submarine when those shells hit, the experience was apocalyptic. The armor-piercing rounds would tear through the steel hull as if it were sheet metal, creating holes that admitted seawater under tremendous pressure. A single hit could be fatal. Multiple hits were absolutely devastating. To the submariners who survived such attacks, and there were not many who did, it felt as though the ocean itself was tearing their boat apart. The sea would pour in through the shell holes faster than any pump could handle, flooding compartments, shorting out electrical systems, dragging the submarine down to crush depth where the pressure would finish what the shells had started. One German submariner, among the handful who survived an encounter with a Tsetse and lived to speak of it afterward, captured the terror of the experience in simple words that nevertheless conveyed the horror. "We feared the destroyers, that much is true. But we cursed the wooden plane. It appeared so fast, flying so low that we barely saw it coming. And when its shells struck our boat, we knew immediately that we were finished. There was no hope, no chance of survival." This represented the personalization of warfare in its most brutal form. The Mosquito Tsetse was not merely a tool of war, not just another weapon system in the vast arsenal of military technology. It had become a character in the drama of the Atlantic, a protagonist in its own right. It was a wooden executioner armed with teeth stolen from a tank destroyer, and it brought death with a precision and certainty that no other anti-submarine weapon could match. The Bay of Biscay, that body of water between France and Spain, became the stage where this dramatic transformation played out most clearly. On one side of this contest stood the U-boats, steel leviathans built by the finest engineers of the Third Reich, submarines that rose to the surface periodically to breathe, trusting in their thick armour, their reputation, and the terror they inspired. On the other side descended a Ghost crafted from plywood and balsa wood, powered by engines that screamed as it dove, bringing with it the same gun that German tank crews had learned to fear on the battlefields of Africa and Europe. The contrast could not have been starker or more dramatic. Steel versus wood, the depths versus the sky, the wolf versus what seemed like nothing more dangerous than a fly, until that fly revealed its cannon and demonstrated that wood armed with the right weapon could indeed kill steel with shocking efficiency. The hunter-killer doctrine that the Allies had developed through hard experience and considerable thought had finally found its perfect blade, its ultimate instrument of execution. Radar could locate U-boats on the surface. Ultra-intelligence could predict where submarines would be. Destroyers and escort carriers could close the trap, preventing escape. But when the moment came for the final killing blow, when it was time to ensure that a detected U-boat did not escape to fight another day, it was the Mosquito Tsetse that delivered. It provided the instant, merciless kill that no U-boat captain could evade once spotted. Each time a submarine surfaced to recharge its batteries or to transit through the Bay of Biscay, it became a torment for the crew. Was the sky truly empty above them, or was a Tsetse circling up there, invisible against the clouds, its pilot watching the submarine through his sights, waiting for the perfect moment to dive and attack? The crucial time period remained those 18 seconds between the sighting of an aircraft and the moment when a submarine was safely submerged. German crews had drilled for this scenario endlessly. They knew that speed was survival. The moment an alarm sounded, every man had his assigned position and his specific tasks. Some would seal the upper hatches, others would open valves to flood the ballast tanks. The diving planes would tilt to drive the boat under the surface as quickly as possible. 18 seconds was enough time, barely, to get the boat below the surface where it would be protected by the water itself. But 18 seconds was also exactly the amount of time that the Tsetse needed to line up its shot, dive within range, and unleash its cannon. The margin between survival and destruction had become razor-thin, a race measured in heartbeats where a delay of even a few seconds meant the difference between a submarine that escaped and one that died. The Atlantic had been transformed by this weapon into a theatre of contrasts that seemed almost literary in their starkness. Steel against wood, depth against sky, the wolf against the fly. And the fly, improbably, carried a cannon that made it more dangerous than any destroyer, more feared than any depth charge pattern. The age of German submarine supremacy was drawing to a close, hastened toward its end by an aircraft that many had initially dismissed as too fragile, too wooden to serve as a serious weapon of war. That night in the Bay of Biscay, December 23, 1943, the ocean spread out beneath a winter moon that bled silver light across the waves. The transformation of the water under moonlight created an illusion of calm, turning the sea's surface into something resembling hammered metal or polished glass. Standing on the conning tower of U-128, Captain Werner Beck felt the cold air biting at his exposed skin as he raised his binoculars to scan the horizon in all directions. Inside his submarine, the batteries that powered the electric motors used for underwater propulsion were nearly exhausted. His men, crammed into the submarine's hull, gasped for air that had grown stale and thin during their submerged transit. Beck had no choice but to surface, despite the danger. The diesel engines needed to run to recharge the batteries, and the crew needed fresh air before the carbon dioxide levels inside the pressure hull reached dangerous concentrations. The phrase that echoed in Beck's mind, that had been drilled into him during his training and reinforced through years of experience commanding U-boats, was simple: crash dive on warning. Every submarine captain knew these words intimately. They represented the thin line between survival and death. The moment a threat was spotted, whether it was a destroyer on the horizon or an aircraft overhead, the U-boat would execute its crash dive, flooding ballast tanks and driving the boat beneath the surface as quickly as possible. Beck knew the risks involved in surfacing. He had heard the stories from other captains, the accounts of U-boats caught on the surface by Allied aircraft and destroyed before they could dive. But he also knew that his boat would suffocate if he did not surface soon. He would take his chances with the open sky rather than guarantee death by asphyxiation or battery exhaustion below. Minutes, Beck thought to himself, just a few minutes running on the surface to get some charge into the batteries and some air into the boat, then he could dive again and continue toward his patrol area. Above U-128, invisible to Beck and his lookouts, squadron leader Charles Anderson's Mosquito Tsetse cut through the darkness like a knife through cloth. The radar set in Anderson's aircraft had already betrayed the submarine's presence. On the glowing scope in front of the radar operator, U-128 appeared as a pale return, a blob of light that marked the position of the steel submarine against the dark water. Anderson received the information and banked his wooden aircraft hard, turning toward the contact. The massive 57mm cannon that protruded from his Mosquito's nose caught occasional glints of moonlight as the aircraft maneuvered. Anderson's hand tightened around the control stick, his eyes narrowing as he began his attack run. This was the moment that all his training had prepared him for, the opportunity to use the devastating weapon his aircraft carried. Then came the critical seconds when hunter and prey became aware of each other. Anderson's keen eyes, aided by the moonlight reflecting off the water, spotted the pale wake created by U-128's passage through the sea. The submarine's deck glistened wet with spray, and he could make out what appeared to be men moving on the conning tower, dark shapes against the lighter metal of the submarine's hull. Anderson pushed the throttle forward, demanding maximum power from his twin engines. The Merlin engines responded with a scream of increased revolutions, their sound cutting through the night. The wooden wonder of British aviation engineering transformed in that moment into something resembling a dart or an arrow plunging down from the heavens toward its target. On the bridge of U-128, one of the lookouts suddenly shouted a warning. Beck jerked his head upward, following the direction of the lookout's pointing arm. Against the bright disk of the moon, a silhouette had appeared, the unmistakable shape of an aircraft diving toward them at frightening speed. The silhouette was growing larger with terrifying rapidity, meaning the aircraft was closing on them fast, far too fast for comfort. Beck's training took over instantly. His voice rose in a shout that carried clearly despite the wind. "Alarm! Crash dive! Crash dive!" The klaxon mounted inside the submarine began its distinctive wailing sound, a noise designed to penetrate into every compartment of the boat. Men responded instantly to that sound, moving to their crash dive stations with the practiced efficiency of repeated drills. The crew members who had been on the conning tower or the deck tumbled down through the hatches, desperate to get inside before the boat submerged. The hatches were slammed shut and sealed. Below in the control room, valves were opened to flood the ballast tanks with seawater, destroying the submarine's positive buoyancy. Steel groaned as the U-boat began to slip beneath the surface, tons of water rushing into the tanks, tilting the boat's nose down. But time, that most precious of commodities in combat, had already run out for U-128. Anderson had closed to attacking range. The ocean surged beneath the wings of his Mosquito as he brought the aircraft lower and lower until salt spray from the wave tops licked at his windscreen. The cannon that dominated his aircraft's nose was lined up perfectly with the target, the submarine that was just beginning its desperate dive. Anderson could see every detail now, the water streaming off the U-boat's deck, the conning tower starting to dip below the surface, the desperate urgency of men trying to escape the certain death that was about to descend upon them. 18 seconds had separated the first warning from this moment. 18 seconds was the span of time between the lookout's shout and the instant when Anderson's finger squeezed the trigger. That gap between life and death, measured in rapid heartbeats and frantic movements, had now closed completely. Anderson fired his cannon. The Mosquito shuddered violently, more dramatically than it ever did from mere turbulence or manoeuvring. The entire airframe shook as the 57mm gun fired, unleashing its fury. The roar of the cannon firing was louder than the scream of the Merlin engines, a sound that seemed to physically strike anyone who heard it. Flame spat from the barrel, illuminating the darkness for an instant with yellow-orange light. In the space of just 1.5 seconds, Anderson fired a burst of multiple shells, each one following the other down toward the submarine that had nowhere left to run. The armor-piercing rounds crossed the distance between aircraft and submarine almost instantaneously, arriving with the force of small meteorites. The shells struck U-128 just as the submarine was beginning to slide beneath the waves, at that most vulnerable moment when it was neither fully surfaced nor safely submerged. For Captain Beck and the 70 men crammed into his submarine, the effect of those armor-piercing shells hitting home was nothing short of apocalyptic. A metallic shriek echoed through the control room, a sound like nothing any of them had heard before, the scream of thick steel being torn open by irresistible force. Gauges mounted on the control panels burst in sprays of glass and fluid as the submarine's systems suffered catastrophic damage. Water began spraying through ruptures in the pressure hull, not the slow seepage of a minor leak, but violent jets of seawater entering under tremendous pressure. The compartment lighting flickered, several bulbs exploding, and then the lights died completely as electrical systems shorted out from the incoming water. In the darkness, lit only by emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie red glow, panic erupted among the crew. Men's voices rose in shouts. "Flooding! We have flooding! Hull breach! Multiple hull breaches!" The damage control parties tried to respond, but there was no controlling damage on this scale. Beck gripped the handles of the periscope mount, his knuckles turning white from the pressure he exerted. He had commanded this submarine through multiple war patrols, had survived depth charge attacks, and had sunk Allied merchant ships, earning decorations for his skill and courage. But in mere seconds, his boat had been gutted by an enemy he had barely seen. A wooden aircraft, something that by all rights should have been harmless compared to a steel submarine, had torn his command apart as easily as a knife slicing through fabric. Beck made the only decision available to him, the only choice that might save some of his crew. "Surface!" he roared above the chaos. "Emergency blow all tanks! Surface the boat now!" The men at the controls responded, opening valves that forced high-pressure compressed air into the ballast tanks, driving out the water that had been flooding in for the crash dive. U-128 thrashed upward like a wounded whale, fighting against the water pouring in through the shell holes, struggling to reach the surface. White foam erupted around the submarine as it broke through the waves, crippled and helpless, forced back into the open air by the extent of its damage. The proud predator of the Atlantic, the submarine that had hunted convoys with such confidence, was now reduced to raising a white cloth in surrender. Men scrambled onto the deck, some waving frantically at the sky, others simply standing frozen in despair at what had happened to their boat. The Steel Wolf had been brought down by a wooden aircraft, and the crew knew with absolute certainty that their submarine was doomed. Above them, Anderson pulled his Mosquito away, climbing back into the night sky, his mission complete. There was no need for a second attack run. One burst from his cannon, fired at exactly the right moment, had accomplished what depth charges might have failed to achieve even after hours of attack. The sea would take U-128 from this point. The submarine was finished. Anderson had written another entry in the growing legend of the Mosquito Tsetse, adding one more kill to the tally of U-boats destroyed by this improbable weapon. This encounter in the Bay of Biscay was not an isolated incident, not a lucky hit that happened once and could be dismissed as an anomaly. It was instead a pattern that would repeat itself again and again throughout 1944, turning those waters into a graveyard for submarines and spreading fear throughout the entire U-boat force. In August of that year, a formation of Mosquito Tsetses from RAF's 248 Squadron encountered 3 German submarines running together on the surface, travelling in company for mutual protection. The German captains had likely hoped that 3 boats together would be safer than one travelling alone, that combined lookouts would spot threats earlier and combined anti-aircraft firepower would drive off any attacking planes. They were wrong. The Tsetses dove on the submarines like hawks stooping on prey, their cannons blazing. R-168 staggered under the impact of multiple armour-piercing shells that punched through its pressure hull. Within minutes of the attack, the submarine began to sink, water pouring in faster than the pumps could possibly handle. The crew abandoned ship, taking to life rafts and hoping for rescue. U-185 also took terrible damage from the cannon fire, its hull ripped open in several places. The submarine managed to stay afloat long enough to limp back toward port, but it was mortally wounded and would never sail on patrol again. The 3rd submarine in the formation managed to escape by diving quickly, shaken but alive, its crew forever haunted by how close they had come to sharing the fate of their comrades. A single strike by the wooden aircraft had shattered an entire wolf pack, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of the Tsetse. The destruction extended beyond the attack submarines to the vital support vessels that kept the wolf packs operational. The Germans had developed a class of submarine known as the milch cows, Type 14 U-boats that were designed not for attacking Allied shipping, but for refueling and resupplying the attack submarines far out in the Atlantic. These milch cows served as underwater tankers, carrying diesel fuel, food, fresh water, and replacement torpedoes. They allowed attack submarines to remain on patrol for extended periods without returning to base. The Allies recognized the critical role these supply submarines played and targeted them relentlessly. One such vessel, U-488, found itself under attack by Mosquito Tsetses while conducting a refueling operation in the mid-Atlantic. The cannon shells ripped across the submarine's deck, damaging equipment and killing crew members who were above deck handling the fuel lines. The submarine was forced to break off its resupply mission and run for home, but it was already doomed. The damage it had sustained would prove mortal, and the attack submarines it was supposed to refuel were left stranded, forced to abort their patrols due to lack of fuel and return to base prematurely. The loss of even one milch cow had a ripple effect, impacting dozens of attack submarines and strangling their operational range. The Germans began referring to the weapon with a name that combined respect and dread. Das große Kanonenflugzeug, which translated as the big gun plane. This was no legend or myth whispered in port bars. This was a real killer with wings, a wooden assassin that carried a cannon capable of tearing submarines apart in seconds. The name spread through the U-boat force, and every submariner knew what it meant. When the word came down that a comrade's boat had been lost to the big gun plane, knowing nods would be exchanged. The Tsetse had claimed another victim. For the crews who survived encounters with the Mosquito Tsetse and lived to tell about their experiences, the memories remained vivid for the rest of their lives. One German submariner, interviewed years after the war ended, recalled the attack with words that still carried the weight of trauma. First you would hear the roar of the aircraft's engines as it dove on you, a sound that seemed to grow impossibly loud. Then the sea itself would scream as those shells hit the water around you or tore into your boat. Holes would suddenly appear in the steel hull, holes that had no business being there, holes that let the ocean pour in with unstoppable force. In that moment, we knew with absolute certainty that everything was finished. There was no hope of escape, no chance of survival. The boat was already dead, we just hadn't sunk yet. The Mosquito Tsetse represented a fundamentally different kind of weapon from anything else employed in anti-submarine warfare during World War II. Unlike depth charges or bombs, which attacked through the indirect method of creating a pressure wave or explosion near the submarine, the Tsetse's cannon struck directly. It aimed, it fired, and it tore the life out of its prey with brutal efficiency. Every engagement was personal in a way that few other forms of combat could match. The pilot could see his target clearly, sometimes close enough to make out individual men on the submarine's deck. The submarine crew could see their attacker, could watch the wooden aircraft screaming down toward them, could see the muzzle flash when the cannon fired. Predator and prey were locked together in a duel that lasted only seconds but carried absolute consequences. The climax of this strange and savage weapon's career cannot be measured solely by counting the number of submarines it destroyed, though that number was significant. The true measure of the Tsetse's impact lay in the fear it generated, in the psychological weight it placed on every U-boat captain who had to surface in the Bay of Biscay. The fear gripped men's hearts as they stood on their conning towers, scanning the sky and knowing that the fastest crash dive might still be too slow if a Tsetse was lurking above. The fear came from the knowledge that a weapon built from wood, which should have been fragile and harmless, could kill their steel submarine as easily as crushing an eggshell. 18 seconds, which had once been enough time to escape danger, had become 18 seconds of terror where every heartbeat might be the last. Steel had screamed under the impact of those armour-piercing shells. Wood, improbably, had prevailed over metal, and in those fleeting moments when cannon met pressure hull, the entire reign of the U-boat as master of the Atlantic came crashing down in violence and fire and seawater flooding through torn metal. The weapon that Winston Churchill had feared most, the U-boat force that had nearly strangled Britain into submission, had met its match in the form of a wooden aircraft carrying a tank-killing gun. The sinking of U-128, along with all the other submarines that fell victim to the Mosquito Tsetse's devastating cannon, represented far more than the simple loss of individual vessels and their crews. Each submarine destroyed was a crack in the foundation of the entire U-boat campaign, and those cracks were spreading and multiplying. Word of the wooden aircraft with its impossible gun travelled quickly through the cramped confines of the submarine pens along the French coast at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. Men gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices about the latest losses. They whispered about an aircraft built from plywood that somehow carried a cannon large enough to punch through a pressure hull. They spoke of submarines that had been ripped open in seconds, their carefully engineered steel hulls torn apart as if they were made of paper. They talked about crash dives that had been interrupted halfway through, about the ocean pouring in through holes that no amount of damage control could seal. The sea, which had always been the submarine's ally and refuge, had betrayed them in the end. From a strategic perspective, the impact of the Mosquito Tsetse became immediately apparent in the broader patterns of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Bay of Biscay, which had functioned for years as a relatively safe corridor allowing U-boats to transit between their bases and the open Atlantic hunting grounds, transformed into a gauntlet that every submarine crew dreaded. The coastal command patrols, now armed with Tsetses, had turned those waters into what amounted to a killing field. No U-boat could surface without accepting tremendous risk, and submarines had to surface regularly. Their diesel engines needed to run to recharge the batteries that powered underwater propulsion, and the crews needed fresh air to replace the carbon dioxide that built up inside the sealed hull. The mathematics of submarine operations demanded surfacing, but surfacing now meant gambling with death. The milch cows, those Type 14 supply submarines that had extended the operational range of the attack boats by providing refueling and resupply far from base, became priority targets for the Mosquito Tsetses. These submarines were larger and slower than attack boats, and they spent extended periods on the surface during refueling operations, making them particularly vulnerable. As the milch cows were hunted down and destroyed one by one, the entire wolf pack system began to starve. Attack submarines found their operational radius shrinking dramatically. Boats that had once been able to patrol far out in the mid-Atlantic, attacking convoys beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, now found themselves forced to return to base prematurely when their fuel ran low. Some submarines were forced to abort their patrols entirely before even reaching their assigned areas, retreating back to France because the milch cow they were supposed to rendezvous with had been sunk. The destruction of the supply submarines strangled the wolf packs, limiting their range and reducing their effectiveness even when they managed to find convoys. The hunter-killer doctrine that the Allies had developed through painful experience and considerable loss had finally reached its ultimate expression. The system was complete, with each piece working in coordination with the others. Ultra-intelligence, derived from breaking German codes, revealed where U-boats would be positioned. Radar confirmed the locations of submarines with precision that seemed almost supernatural to the Germans who didn't know their codes had been compromised. Destroyers and destroyer escorts tightened the noose around detected submarines, preventing escape. Escort carriers provided air cover and strike capabilities far from land, and when the moment came for the final killing stroke, it was not the imprecise scatter of depth charges that sealed the fate of German submarines. It was the focused, devastating impact of a 57mm cannon fired from the nose of a wooden aircraft. The system had achieved a kind of terrible perfection, and the wolves who had once terrorized the Atlantic found themselves with no way out, no escape from the trap that had been constructed around them. For the Germans, the consequences of the Tsetse's appearance went far deeper than simple tactical adjustments. Admiral Dönitz, recognizing that his submarines could no longer surface with any degree of safety in the Bay of Biscay, issued new orders to his commanders. U-boats were instructed to remain submerged for as much of their transit as physically possible. They were equipped with snorkels, devices that allowed the diesel engines to run while the submarine was at periscope depth, taking in air through a tube that extended above the surface. In theory, this should have allowed submarines to recharge their batteries while remaining mostly submerged and thus protected from air attack. But this solution was born from desperation rather than strength. Travelling on snorkel power slowed the U-boats dramatically, reducing their transit speed and making them clumsy and difficult to maneuver. The snorkel itself could be detected by radar. Submarines operating this way were effectively half-blind, unable to use their periscopes continuously, dependent on the snorkel remaining above water. The hunters of 1942, submarines that had roamed the Atlantic with confidence and independence, had by 1944 been reduced to fugitives, hiding in the very element they were supposed to dominate. The psychological toll on the U-boat crews was perhaps even more devastating than the physical losses. Submariners had always known that theirs was a dangerous profession. They were sealed inside steel tubes, surrounded by the crushing pressure of the ocean, dependent on machinery that could fail at any moment. But they had accepted these dangers because of the effectiveness of the U-boat as a weapon and the relative safety it provided when handled skillfully. Now, however, they faced a new terror that was harder to rationalize or accept. The act of surfacing, which they had to perform regularly simply to survive, might summon death from the sky in the form of a wooden aircraft that appeared without warning. 18 seconds, which had always been considered sufficient time to crash dive, was no longer enough time to escape if a Tsetse had already begun its attack run. The crews knew this, and the knowledge gnawed at them every single time their boats broke the surface. One survivor of multiple Bay of Biscay patrols wrote in his diary, which was later published after the war, "We had come to believe that the sea itself had turned against us. It felt as though even the air above the water had become our enemy. The Mosquito represented something we could not fight. We could not shoot it down with our deck guns before it attacked. It came too fast and too low. We could not dive quickly enough to escape once it appeared. 18 seconds was simply not enough time. And we could not remain submerged indefinitely. Eventually we had to surface, and that meant rolling the dice with our lives." This captured the essence of the psychological burden that the Tsetse placed on every submariner who had to operate in waters where it might be lurking. The Mosquito Tsetse did not, by itself, sink hundreds of U-boats. The actual number of submarines destroyed directly by Tsetse attacks was measured in dozens rather than hundreds. But the weapon's presence and reputation amplified the effectiveness of every other anti-submarine measure the Allies employed. The very possibility that a Tsetse might be overhead forced submarines to remain submerged longer, which reduced their effectiveness as convoy attackers. It forced them to use snorkels for transit, which slowed their movement and made them more vulnerable to other forms of detection. It contributed to the psychological pressure that made the U-boat service one of the most dangerous and stressful assignments in the German military. The Tsetse became a symbol, the blade at the heart of the hunter-killer machine that the Allies had constructed, and its symbolic power exceeded even its very real combat effectiveness. Every U-boat captain who climbed to his conning tower to scan the sky carried the image of the Tsetse in his mind. He would picture the aircraft appearing suddenly from the clouds, its wooden frame somehow carrying that enormous cannon. He would imagine the flash of the gun firing, the thunderous roar that would announce his doom. He would see in his mind the holes appearing in his submarine's hull, the water pouring in with unstoppable force, the lights failing as electrical systems shorted out. These images haunted German submariners, invading their thoughts during the long hours of patrol and the brief moments of uneasy sleep. The wooden aircraft had achieved a psychological dominance that went far beyond its actual combat record. By the time 1944 was well underway, the statistical evidence told a story that the German Naval Command could no longer ignore or explain away. Convoy losses to U-boat attack had fallen sharply from their peak in 1942. The rate at which Allied merchant ships were being sunk had dropped to levels that were sustainable, even acceptable from the Allied perspective. Meanwhile, U-boat losses had mounted steadily, climbing month by month to unsustainable levels. The wolf packs that had once operated with such devastating effectiveness were being shattered, broken apart by the relentless pressure of Allied anti-submarine forces. The doctrine of mass attacks on convoys, which had been the foundation of U-boat strategy, had been reduced to isolated, desperate strikes by submarines that were lucky to survive long enough to attack at all. The balance of power in the Atlantic had shifted fundamentally and irreversibly. The sea lanes that had run red with Allied blood in 1942 now flowed freely with supplies, equipment, and men heading to Europe to support the invasion that would eventually end the war. In the aftermath of the Tsetse's deployment and the broader success of the Allied anti-submarine campaign, the legend of the U-boat was irrevocably broken. The wolves of the deep had discovered, to their horror and dismay, that they too could be hunted, that they were not the ocean's ultimate predators, but merely one more prey species in a food chain that had turned against them. Even worse than the physical danger they faced was the psychological realization that their nemesis was not made from steel or armor, but from wood and fabric and glue. The irony was brutal enough to be almost poetic. The Third Reich had built its military pride from iron and armor, trusting in the strength of steel and the power of massive, heavily armored weapons. Yet it was a fragile creation assembled from plywood sheets, a wooden aircraft that seemed like it should have been harmless, that stripped the U-boats of their terror and sent them to the bottom of the Atlantic. The wolf packs were finished as an effective fighting force. The ocean that they had dominated for the first years of the war was no longer their domain. It had become instead their grave, a vast cemetery where hundreds of submarines and thousands of submariners would find their final rest. The Mosquito Tsetse, despite its relatively small production numbers and limited service period, had played a significant role in this transformation, punching above its weight and creating an impact far larger than its numbers would suggest. The wooden wonder with steel fangs had helped rewrite the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Mosquito Tsetse was never produced in large quantities. The total number of Mosquitoes converted to carry the 57mm cannon remained relatively small, barely a few dozen aircraft out of the thousands of Mosquitoes built for various roles during the war. Yet despite these limited numbers, the legacy and impact of the Tsetse extended far beyond what simple statistics or production figures might suggest. The weapon's true measure lay not in tonnage of submarines sunk, though that was significant, but in the terror it inspired among those who faced it and the psychological burden it placed on an entire branch of the German military. For the U-boat crews who had the misfortune to encounter the Tsetse in combat, the memory of those encounters remained vivid for the rest of their lives. These men had faced many dangers during their service. They had endured depth charge attacks that went on for hours, with explosive charges detonating around their submerged boats, each explosion feeling like a hammer blow against the hull, the lights flickering with each impact, glass breaking, cork insulation falling from the pressure hull like snow. They had learned to endure those attacks, to maintain their composure during the long ordeal of being hunted by destroyers. Those were blind weapons, brutal and dangerous, but ultimately imprecise. Hammers striking in the dark, hoping to hit their target. A well-built submarine handled by a skilled crew could often survive depth charge attacks, could ride out the storm of explosions and surface later, damaged perhaps but still operational. The Tsetse was something entirely different. It was precise where depth charges were imprecise. It was personal where other attacks were anonymous. The pilot could see his target, and the target could see the attacking aircraft. The weapon aimed directly at the submarine with the accuracy of a rifle rather than the scatter of a shotgun. Survivors spoke of shells that tore open their pressure hulls as though some impossibly powerful hand had simply punched through the steel. One man, interviewed decades after the war when he was old and grey but still haunted by his experiences, whispered the words that encapsulated the horror. 18 seconds. That was all the time we had between seeing the aircraft and hearing the shells hit our boat. 18 seconds, and then we were gone. The boat was dead. We just hadn't finished sinking yet. The psychological weight of those words, the trauma embedded in that simple statement, outlived the weapon itself by many years. The U-boat force, which had once been the pride of the German Navy, which had struck fear into the hearts of Allied merchant sailors, which had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic through sheer ruthless efficiency, no longer inspired dread in their enemies. Instead, by the war's end, they inspired something closer to pity. The statistics told a story of catastrophic losses. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, nearly 800 U-boats had been sent to the bottom of the Atlantic and other oceans. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during the war, nearly 30,000 never returned home, killed in action or going down with their boats. 3 out of every 4 submariners died during the war, making the U-boat service the most dangerous assignment in the entire German military by a substantial margin. The proud hunters of the Atlantic had become the most doomed branch of Germany's armed forces, and while many factors contributed to this catastrophic loss rate, the Mosquito Tsetse had played its part in creating the conditions that made U-boat service a near-suicide assignment. The legacy of the Tsetse extended beyond its combat record into the realm of symbolism and what it represented. Here was a weapon constructed from materials that seemed wholly inadequate for military aviation. Plywood, balsa wood, and adhesive were not what anyone would choose to build a warplane from if conventional materials were available. Yet the British, facing shortages of aluminum and steel, had created the Mosquito from these humble materials and had produced an aircraft that excelled in virtually every role to which it was assigned. The Tsetse represented the ultimate evolution of this concept, a wooden aircraft armed with a single massive cannon that had humbled the Reich's pride in steel and armour. The contrast between the weapon and its target was stark, fragility defeating strength, speed defeating mass, ingenuity and innovation defeating raw industrial power. In the wooden wings and steel fangs of the Tsetse, the world glimpsed a fundamental truth about modern warfare that would become increasingly relevant as technology advanced. Survival in combat belonged not necessarily to the strongest or the most heavily armoured, but to those who could adapt most quickly to changing circumstances. The rigid German thinking that had produced the U-boat as a weapon system had been unable to counter the flexible, innovative Allied response that produced the Tsetse. The submarine, which had seemed like such a revolutionary and dominant weapon in the early war years, had been defeated not by a bigger submarine or a heavier ship, but by something as simple as an anti-tank gun mounted in a wooden aircraft. Historians and military analysts sometimes debate whether the Mosquito Tsetse actually changed the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic, or whether it merely illustrated and symbolized changes that were already underway for other reasons. But for the men who fought beneath the shadow of that wooden aircraft, for the submariners who surfaced to recharge their batteries and scanned the sky for that distinctive silhouette, there was no debate and no uncertainty. They remembered with perfect clarity what it was like to break the surface and breathe in the fresh air while simultaneously listening for the sound of aircraft engines. They remembered seeing a speck appear on the horizon or emerge from the clouds, watching it grow larger as it dove toward them at terrifying speed. They remembered the impossible sight of a cannon, a weapon that should never have been mounted in an aircraft, flashing fire from the nose of what appeared to be a fragile wooden plane. They remembered the sound of shells striking steel, the scream of metal being torn apart, the roar of water flooding in through holes that should never have existed, and they remembered the silence that followed, the terrible quiet after the attack when the only sound was water and the groans of dying machinery. In the final analysis, the Mosquito Tsetse was far more than just another machine in the vast military-industrial complex of World War II. It transcended its role as a weapon system to become a message, a demonstration of what could be achieved when necessity drove innovation. It told the world that even in the darkest hours of the war, when the Battle of the Atlantic seemed lost and Britain stood on the edge of starvation, imagination and ingenuity could carve victory from the jaws of despair. The Tsetse reminded both friend and foe that in warfare, nothing is truly invincible. Nothing is eternal, not even weapons as feared and effective as the U-boat had been. Every military system, no matter how dominant it seems, carries within it vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those clever enough to find them and bold enough to act on that knowledge. The Atlantic Ocean continued to roll after 1945, its waves unchanged by the human conflict that had raged across its surface for 6 years. The water was calm once more, or at least as calm as the Atlantic ever becomes, but it had been changed forever by what had transpired during those war years. Beneath the surface, scattered across thousands of square miles of ocean floor, lay the carcasses of German U-boats, steel tombs containing the remains of thousands of men who had once believed themselves to be the ocean's masters. These submarines had been sent to the bottom by many different weapons and tactics: depth charges from destroyers, bombs from aircraft, torpedoes from Allied submarines, and yes, shells from the 57mm cannon mounted in the nose of a wooden aircraft. And overhead, preserved in the collective memory of history and in the written records of the war, the wooden predator still circles, forever frozen in that dramatic moment of its attack dive. The image remains vivid, the Mosquito Tsetse dropping from the sky like a falcon stooping on prey, its cannon lined up perfectly with the submarine that is desperately trying to crash dive, trying to reach the safety of the depths before those fatal shells can be fired. That moment, repeated again and again during 1943 and 1944, represents the instant when 18 seconds decided the fate not just of individual men and machines, but of entire strategic campaigns, and perhaps of empires themselves. Steel sank beneath the waves, taking with it the men who had trusted in its strength. Wood endured, lighter than steel, but armed with a weapon that made it more deadly than any amount of armor could withstand. And those 18 seconds, which passed in mere heartbeats, but contained entire lifetimes of terror and violence, became something approaching eternity in the memories of those who lived through them. The U-boat, which had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic through its effectiveness and the terror it inspired, had been defeated. The Mosquito Tsetse, that improbable wooden aircraft carrying an impossible cannon, had played its part in that defeat. The wolves of the Atlantic had learned fear, and the ocean had changed hands, no longer belonging to those who prowled beneath its surface, but to those who controlled the skies above.